So we have here today my mentor, Victor Black, and I just want to introduce Victor to you. So Victor, do you mind explaining a little bit about yourself and what you do, just for my listeners on my end of the podcast?
Sure. Congratulations on starting the podcast too, buddy. That's awesome.
Thank you very much, Victor.
I can tell you from personal experience, starting to make a podcast is both a little bit intimidating. I think that's fair to say, for someone that hasn't run a podcast, but it is an exercise that, in my opinion, will benefit your business as a coach. Yeah. And it will also help you in terms of your future learning. I run a podcast. I don't have as many episodes as I like. I think most people could relate to that. We get caught up and busy, and I would like to make more content, but it's definitely one of the keystone activities that I've done over the last couple of years that I would highly recommend to anyone in this game. Even if you have a very small audience, even if you're starting off humbly, first episode, as you said. So kudos to you. Well done. Right. So about me. A couple of years ago, I would have probably started this conversation basically saying, nobody knows who the hell I am. And things are changing. We've now gotten to the point 7 years after I started making public content that my name has become synonymous with the world of performance enhancing drugs, specifically evidence-based coaching. It's fair to say a degree of controversy as well, because I've been a fairly disruptive force. I actually would say I'm probably the most disruptive force in bodybuilding in the last 50 years. So less and less people have never heard of me, and more people are interested in, what is the conversation, what's going on over here. And fundamentally that would be this, and that is I'm trying to bring to the discussion table what I consider to be evidence-based practice. So I'm not sure whether this is the first call, so we really don't have an audience profile, but you have a client-based profile. Yeah. Do we need to start off by explaining what evidence-based practice is, or will your audience immediately know? Okay, cool. All right, so let's start off. There's a couple of names I'm going to throw under the bus here. People like Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, people like Dr. Eric Helms, Alan Aragon. There's a list of them. You could just keep going and going, but let's just name a few. Hopefully people will have at least heard of these individuals. And if you understand what's been happening over the last decade, really, in the fitness industry, is these individuals have been helping us to better understand sports science and the application of sports science towards, fundamentally what is amateur or recreational bodybuilding, powerlifting, and strength sports. Okay. Traditionally, professional athletic teams, the type that you find, I'm Australian, so if you went to the Australian Institute of Sport, they have high-level coaches that, instruct their elite athletes in these disciplines. But the average guy, the average commercial training center, for a very long time was led by the nose of what I call the biggest guy in the gym must know what he's talking about, which is interesting because, you have to give some credit and some weight to experience and seeing a return from the investment, which is, a very valid point of discussion. But it's also fair to say that, particularly in my world, good genetics and far too much drugs have the potential to mask very bad practices. Yeah. So for about a decade now, we've had this movement that has really been focused on training practices, nutritional practices, and supplementation practices, trying to bring evidence-based training to the fore. And I think I don't think it's a overstatement to say they have wiped bro science from the face of the planet, but they've made a lot of ground. I think that's fair. They've made a lot of ground. And what I'm endeavoring to do is basically take these same frameworks, but go into the taboo subject of performance enhancement practices and bring these same disciplines with us. So what we're trying to do here is effectively have a dialogue that involves three tenets. The first tenet is, so what does the sports science, or in the case of pharmacology, what does the clinical evidence have to say on this subject matter? Yeah. Two is, what does my 40 years of experience have to say? And then there's another 20 years behind that. I think it's fair to say we have 50, 60 years of anecdotal observation. I said I've been making content for 7 years, but I've been training and competing initially as a natural athlete for 20 years and then 20 years on top of that as an enhanced bodybuilder. So what does that have to say? Because very often what the sports science has to say and what observation have to say, they have the potential to disagree with each other at times. Yeah. Sometimes they line up, sometimes they don't. And then the third tenet would be what I refer to as loosely as client preference. So if we have an outcome that says, look, there doesn't appear to be a massive deviation between option A and option B, does the client have a preference? Yeah. And so this tends to lead itself into things like most people can appreciate from a nutritionally modeling point. If we just talk about nutrition for a second, there isn't one way of doing bodybuilding nutrition. There's a framework that has kind of caveats that you need to cover, boxes you need to tick if you want to make it that simple. And then after that, there's a degree of discretion that comes down to client preference. Yeah. So I'm trying to bring these three things to the table, and really my wheelhouse is unashamedly the taboo subject of performance enhancing drugs.
Yes, perfect. You see, Victor, a lot of people where I'm from, I would go into the local gym and a lot of guys would be training. They wouldn't be training for any more than a year. They would be out drinking at weekends. They wouldn't be tracking their calories or on a meal plan or even knowing how much protein they're eating on a daily basis, and they would have no structure in the gym. And these guys would come up and say to me, oh, I'm going to get a course of D-ball. And I'm like, what I explain to them, first thing you need to do is get your training on point, create a novel stimulus, build up your strength over a period of time. Most importantly, your form, your tempo, make sure you're performing the exercise correctly. Make sure you're activating the muscle, squeezing the muscle, removing any elastic energy from the Golgi tendons when you're lifting and keeping isolation and tension on the muscle. Build your weight up over a period of time. And once your strength goes up and you're starting to struggle to progress with like micro loading and stuff like that, you can then accumulate your volume and use like a hybrid model where you then obviously increase your training volume and sort of explain to them that's basically a fundamental tool is your training. Second of all is obviously their nutrition. They need to know how much fuel they're putting in the tank. Are they at maintenance? Are they in a caloric surplus? Are they in a caloric deficit? What is their goals? If it's muscle building, make sure you're eating enough food as fuel to build new tissue, to perform and to actually recover from your training sessions to get stronger. And a lot of people are like, oh, it'll be fine. I just enjoy going to the gym and I'll get a course of D-ball. And you say to them, do you even know what D-ball is? And they're like, oh, it fills you out. And I'm like, this is the problem with beginners nowadays, which I see in Ireland where I'm from. A lot of people in the local gyms, loads of them, Victor, I mean, loads are saying this to me, and they're not taking into account the seriousness of their training. They're not taking into account their, their nutrition or their recovery or anything like this. They're thinking, taking the likes of a methylated oral like D-ball is going to fill them out. They're not even talking about a testosterone base here. I try to explain to them about, later down the line, you could add in testosterone after you have, built some muscle and you want to take it serious. And they explain to me, I don't want to inject. And, this seems to be a big problem in my local community as well. So
can I just, let me just jump in there. There's two key points that you raised here that I think are important touchstones. So firstly, although I do agree with what you're saying, I would counter that with just a couple of remarks, and that is understanding that I'm in my mid-50s and I've been training for 40 years. Sometimes I think that we look back at 20, 30 years ago, the behaviors, people say, oh, they did this and they did that, with a little bit with rose-colored glasses. I'll give you a simple example. When I first got interested in going to the gym, it wasn't really through mainstream bodybuilding. It was through the movies. I grew up in the era where the movie stars of the day, Schwarzenegger and Stallone and Van Damme and that they drew you in not because they were competitive bodybuilders, but they were action men on the screen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's important to understand that a lot of people from my generation were drawn into the gym from watching, what we would call mainstream movies of the day. Yeah. And a lot of the mindset of those individuals, you have to understand, Arnold, I mean, I don't want to make statements that I have no evidence for, but I think it's a fair thing to say. If you look at the historical photographic record, Arnold was clearly using anabolic steroids in his teens.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think so.
So, yeah, well, he has to have been. Like, you look at the photographs of at 19 years old, it's not plausibly natural. Yeah,
no, definitely not.
So, and then you come forward, you jump forward, you pick someone like Lee Priest. And again, I don't know Lee's history. These are assumptions I'm making, and I have to leave enough room to be wrong. That's fair. But when you look at, where he was at 19 years old, I think it's a fair assumption that he already had that door wide open. So the point I'm making here is that I don't know necessarily it is a factual statement to say, today, I think it's always been there. It's always been true, because it's very hard to look at someone who's 19 years old and looks like Arnold looks, or 19 years old and looks at Lee Priest and says, yeah, but you, my friend, Billy, you need to wait until you're 27. It's so I am the point I'm making is I'm extremely empathetic that guys want to get into this game, and it's always been there. It was there when I was young. Now, I'm the exception to the rule, where I trained for 20 years and competed for 20 years as a natural before I opened that door. But I saw people that I was training with and people that were in my, my group, as it were. Yeah. They prematurely went down this path. Now, what I would caution people about, though, is a couple of outcomes from that. One is, it's fair to say that historically we used to use drugs for relatively small blocks of time, and then we would retire. Yeah. So in that time frame, in the 70s time frame, guys retired at 28 years old. That's it. It's over. Now I go and have a family. Even Arnold, it's fair to say that, yes, I agree, he went on to a movie career, and yes, he returned to the stage later, but he retired initially at 28. Big guys retired. One of the big things that has changed in the last 50 years is now you have people like myself who are in their mid-50s, and we're still using drugs.
Yeah.
And that's a profoundly important thing to put on the table, because there's a very big difference between what you can get away with for a couple of years. I'm honest, you can be quite reckless for a couple of years and get away with it. But if you do it and do it and do it, the bill will come due. And one of my core tenets is explaining to guys, look, I'm very serious. Even D-bol, or one of the other less than desirable components of drugs, I'm going to use an analogy. It's a silly analogy, but it is actually remarkably true. And that is this: I don't think anyone ever got lung cancer from smoking for 6 months.
No, definitely not. Yeah.
It's not good for your health, but if you smoke cigarettes and you smoke half a packet a day and you quit after 6 months, it's statistically likely that your body will regenerate the damage that's been done, and you will move on. And I mean, there may be some marginal allocation of risk you have to, adopt, that says, look, 25 years from now, that may have, but it's not wow. But here's the thing: if you do it and do it and do it and do it, 20 years later, the likelihood of you, ultimately ending up with lung disease is almost 1-to-1. It's almost like, dude, you're going to get. And so what I try to explain to guys is, I don't necessarily agree that it's a new phenomenon, because it's always been there. The idols that we aspired to follow, these guys were using drugs way before they should have been. Yeah. And what I would say the greatest message here is, today, 50 years later, we have the great luxury of saying, look, we've learned a tremendous amount on this journey, and there is a way to approach the application of performance-enhancing drugs that allows you to realize your goals, but it also allows you to do it in a safer way. And this is my message I keep talking about, safer PED use. And the core takeaway, if I was to try and give some key messages to young guys and girls that are interested in this space, would be, one is, don't shy away from it, because if they shy away from it, typically what will happen is they'll end up getting bad advice from poorly informed individuals. Let's step up, and it's somewhat much like the safer sex conversation.
Yeah.
You need to be talking to your teenage daughter about sex. Don't make her take it underground. Let's talk about it. So what I would be saying is this: understand that today we have a lifetime exposure model that basically says this, right? We're going to use steroids. I'm not trying to put you off, but what I think you should do is first you should learn everything there is to know about training, and everything there is to know about food, and everything there is to know about over-the-counter supplements before you open that final door.
Agreed.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think any rational mind would go, that's fair enough. What's the point of being waist deep in risk behaviors, okay, taking drugs, if I don't yet fundamentally understand things like progressive overload? A rational mind will go, yeah, that's fair. I need to prioritize. First, I learn about this, then I learn about this, then I learn about this, and then I learn about drugs. And I think if we deliver that message, it's going to be much better received by people, because the logical mind says, yes, I can live with that. You're going to eventually get to that conversation. But now here's the criticism that I would have of the bodybuilding community as a whole. And this is why I say I'm a very controversial figure. I upset a great many people. The reality is that there are the overwhelming majority of people walking around waist deep in drugs still don't understand training and nutrition supplements. So it's all well and good to say your opening statement, here's this guy and he doesn't do this. You're right. But what I would say is, but I also feel that that's probably true of a great many, middle range amateurs and even, aspiring professionals, where they got to because they had good genetics on their side and they took too much drugs.
Oh, absolutely.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So that's a long direction, but I think it's important because it's, as I said, it's very much like the safer sex message. It's saying, I'm not saying you can't have sex, but let's talk about the harsh realities of, the consequences of that action. Let's talk about drugs. This is what we're going to do. But I think you need to understand, let's do training first. Let's do nutrition. Then we can talk about supplements, and then we can talk about pharmacology as the capstone to the conversation.
Yeah, no, 100% agree with you. That's spot on what you've just said there. I have a friend actually. He told me to ask you a few questions.
Sure.
Well, so I have a friend. He started a cycle there last year, and then he started another. He came off for a while, and then he started another cycle now. And I recommend it to him, sort of like, as much testosterone as he can tolerate, and using a scalable drug like primobolan. And he now is taking, without, I have told him not to take this. He's now taking 600 tren, 600 deca, and 500 testosterone. And I have explained to him that, he would be wiser sort of using a drug like Nandrolone at a smaller scale for obviously joint support, and maybe using something rather than as much testosterone, they could scale it something like primobolan. And I just explained to him, trenbolone at his stage probably isn't needed because he's not competing. It's not something he needs, but he's like, but the big guy in the gym told me to.
Agree. Yeah. No, I agree. I guess what I would say is, firstly, is you have to understand there are this is an approximation. Clearly, no one has a hard number, but let's say there is an estimation at 4 million PED users globally. Yep. I think you have to have this conversation from the understanding that the vast majority of those people fall under what's called the Goldman dilemma. Are you familiar with what the Goldman dilemma is?
I've never heard of the Goldman dilemma.
Okay, cool. So it's a premise that basically, a study was done on elite athletes. These are not bodybuilders, athletes, athletics. That basically, proposed this hypothesis or scenario. It said, look, if I could give you a drug that guaranteed you won the Olympic gold medal, but the consequence you were to have a deleterious, event, a health event that followed that, would you take the drug? Yeah, you understand the paradox. The paradox here, yeah. And of course, the question then is, a surprisingly large percentage of people said yes. Now, there was an original study which the data was flawed, the methodology was flawed. But the point is, it wasn't 0%. Let's just say that. There was a percentage of individuals that said, I'm okay with that. Give me the gold medal. Give me the adverse effect. I'm happy to, live young and leave a beautiful corpse, as they say. Yeah. And we have to accept that there's a percentage of individuals within our community that have that mindset. It is a real mindset, which is, I don't think about the future. I'm not concerned. I would argue that we should really try to pick the lowest hanging fruit first. And what I mean by that is, not everyone thinks that way. There's a large body of people that are interested in safety and are interested in health and are saying, look, if there's a safer way to do this, I'm all fucking ears.
Yeah.
Yeah. If someone's not yet listening, you understand they're not listening. Yeah. And I myself, I've learned a tremendous amount over the last 7 years. One of the great life lessons I've learned is I've just spent far too much time trying to convince people of something that's true. Yeah. Now, today, I try to say, look, my content is for people that already know. They already know before they hear me speak that the quality of content that we have on performance enhancing drugs is poor. They come to the table knowing that. Yeah. They come to the table knowing there are risks here. They come to the table looking for solutions. I spent a disproportionate amount of time trying to tell people about the problems, and I realized that it's not good use of my time.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to do the same thing that you were doing. Yeah.
So people are listening to this. This is the interesting paradox here is anyone that's listening to that, we've got that. They've already got that mindset. You understand? They wouldn't be listening otherwise.
That's very true. That is very true. Yeah.
So you have to be very careful as you walk through a gym and you weave your way through it and you say hello to 15 people on the way, that this message is for everyone, but at least half of the people, I would even argue, 75% of the people are not listening, and they're certainly not asking questions. And the best use of our time as educators is to simply seek out those people that already know there's a problem and that are already looking for information. And when they stumble across you, literally their remarks are, thank fuck, I finally found someone that is talking about this, as opposed to, like, and blow you off.
I understand. That's what happens. It's like, you're trying to give them better advice, and it's like, and they don't. And you're like, heck, would you listen?
I was 21 once. I know. I mean, I know what it's like. You're like, it's the. I mean, I don't want to sound like the old bloke, but it's the arrogance of youth. I know everything. I'm 20. It's one of the things I say to people. Like if you're listening to a PED guru and he's 26 years old, you have to ask yourself, well, hang on a sec. I mean, where did he get this experience, to be talking about this thing? Because I would argue that, realistically, if you do this the right way, you really shouldn't be starting drugs until you're in your early 20s.
Yeah.
I really do believe that. Like, I mean, someone could say, you're wrong, but I just honestly believe that you can still make progress naturally learning about training, supplementation, at least up until your early 20s. Right. And then I think you should be doing what we're doing for at least 10 years before you start talking about it. Guys, you see these guys that are 26 years old, and I'm just, how could you possibly have, accumulated enough exposure experience on a personal level to be talking about this? What you're really doing is you're parroting what someone else said.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, this is the industry that we're in. We have a lot of young guys that want to make it on YouTube, and a lot of young guys that realize there's power and influence and financial opportunity as a fitness influencer, and they're in the game too early. One of the reasons that, I pride myself on the fact that in 7 years of making content and being challenged by pretty much every voice there is out there, right, I've never had to concede a single point, and I go to great pains to explain to people. But one of the reasons behind that is I used drugs for 12 years before I spoke about them. So it's not like I didn't make mistakes. like everything I did in the first year was fundamentally wrong, but I wasn't on YouTube talking about it. I was just making mistakes.
Yeah, yeah.
And 12 years later, when I got on my soapbox and started talking about it, it was very hard to argue with it. And I honestly believe this, and that is, I think that really, that's a practical thing. 12 years of use. Now I'm an expert, from application, and I could talk to the application. Whereas you have, I don't know whether you know this, but there are individuals that provide educational content on performance enhancing drugs that have never used them.
I've seen that.
Well, it's a little bit. I mean, it's a little bit difficult. Now, don't get me wrong. If you are a researcher of androgens and your PhD is in androgen toxicity, I'm all ears. But if you are just commenting on performance enhancing drugs, it's like, well, hang on a second, you have no user experience. So anyway,
yeah,
I'm off track.
They haven't walked the walk.
But you have to, and this is part of the process. So, for example, why your friend was using Trenbolone, was biased into Trenbolone, I have no doubt about this, because I've seen it 1,001 times, is because I'm sure someone told him, the bro science, that it's significantly more anabolic or significantly stronger than the other alternatives.
Yeah.
Okay? And just through personal use, if you've never read a study in your life, right, if all you can comment is on my experience as a user, eventually you'll get to the point that says, look, this idea that Anavar, for example, is 6 times more anabolic than testosterone, all you need to do is to do this, and that is, so take a dose of testosterone for a block of time, and then take a dose, an equal dose of Anavar, milligram dose of Anavar, and then look me in the face and say, I grew 6 times faster, I grew 6 times bigger. It's not only not true in the clinical literature, no human being on the planet has ever had that happen to them, ever. And so this is the great paradox behind the content that I make, and that is, not only am I presenting clinical literature and saying, look at these studies, and this is what the studies say, I always go back to my roots and say, in 40 years, have I ever seen an individual grow 5 times faster or 5 times bigger because he introduced Trenbolone? And the answer is, you haven't seen it. I haven't seen it. No one's ever seen it. So why are we walking around saying it's true? It's not supported in the sports science. Now, here's the thing. The third caveat comes through and says, now, if an individual wants to, on the basis of personal choice, say, look, I prefer to use Trenbolone, that's okay. He's entitled to that opinion. But what I would caution him against is understanding this, and that is, different agents, different growth promotion agents have different risk profiles attached to them. So if we have two drugs and they effectively both quote unquote work, they get the job done, I would always try to lean any individual into the more benign choice. So here's option A and here's option B. Option A has this risk profile. Option B has an accelerated risk profile. They both do the job. Every time I'm going to say, let's take the more benign option. Let's take the most benign choice. Yeah. But I am not anyone's mother. If someone says to me, no, screw you, I don't care. Like I respect what you're saying is true. Neither one produces a greater outcome, but I'm prepared to take on that risk. This is what I was saying to you at that point. You have to lead the conversation and let them do their thing, because you will simply expend far too much energy trying to get them to change their mind. They're just going to be nah.
Yeah, it's not worth it. Yeah.
No,
yeah, for
it's
me,
not worth your time.
My time. Yeah.
It's not worth your time, especially as a individual that makes a financial living from this business.
Yeah.
There are enough people out there that are saying, and I'm interested in this, but I want to know the safer way to do it. Just spend your time there.
Yeah. That's very true, Victor. That's a very true point. Thanks for clearing that up.
They will catch up eventually.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
What was I going to say? So let's talk a little bit about the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and like how people, you know, are using aromatase inhibitors thinking that it's estrogen holding water retention, and, you know, basically explain how the the system works, and the likes of angiotensin receptor blockers and the benefits of them for people.
So it's fair to say, let me just back up a little bit and tell it a little bit of preamble might make it clearer for people. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Before the what I refer to as the black models, there were certain things that people said. And one of the things we said, we were touching on before, X anabolic steroid is, you know, 5 times more anabolic than this one. Everybody said that. Everybody walked around
5 times more anabolic than testosterone.
That's what they said. And I don't mean some people, I mean that's what we said. Everybody said that, right? And I explained to people that's not true. Here's the clinical evidence and here's the observational practice. And now I think it's fair to say we've made a lot of ground. There are an awful lot of people saying, look, clearly tren is not 5 times more anabolic than testosterone. That's just not a logical mind that makes that statement. We've never seen that. You've never seen that. It's not supporting the evidence. And the point I'm making is there's a very long list of line items that we can go through that would say these are things we said. One of the things we said was that estrogen causes water retention. Of course, if you ask any, you know, first year medical student, they'll say no, it doesn't. You know, the renin aldosterone and renin angiotensin aldosterone system actually modulates. You know, yes, it is true that estrogen is one of the stimulatory or inhibitory forces that in turn act on the RAAS. That is true. But you have to understand that, so androgens have an impact, estrogens have an impact, progesterones have an impact, growth hormone has an impact. Why are we singling out estrogen? It seems a little unreasonable if you have multiple stimulatory or inhibitory actions on this system and they all have consequence. Why do we pick one? And so, you know, I explained this was true. And then you ask the question, so why are we then attenuating or modulating estrogen to control water retention? Why don't we simply go to the system that's responsible, right, and modulate that? You know, which makes perfect sense. And again, you know, like when you go through the discussion, you go, okay, like you can't argue estrogen does not cause water retention. It's one of the stimulatory or inhibitory factors that act on the system that does. And so the point being is we have this, you know, this we'll call it a drug called estrogen because we're actually introducing testosterone exogenously, and then therefore we'll consider estrogen a metabolite drug. So we have this drug that effectively is a hypertrophic agent in its own right. It causes an increase in muscle protein synthesis, you know, protein accretion. Right? It's cardiac protective of the heart, protective of the kidneys, you know, protective of the brain. On the other hand, we have this, you know, these effector molecules of the RAS system, which are angiotensin 2 and aldosterone. And these things are responsible for most of the problems, most of the ills that plague our tribe. So we have these 2 strategies. One is to introduce an aromatase inhibitor, which lowers estrogen, a protective component and an anabolic agent. And one would be correct. And one would be to lower down the actual effector molecules of the system itself, which are not anabolic and they're not protective. They're actually deleterious on all accounts. So when you think about it, it's very much the same as the 2 options choice. Yes, you can use an aromatase inhibitor and it certainly functions. It works that way. But once you're presented with the alternative, no man in his right mind is going to lower estrogen if you know that you can attenuate these 2 effector molecules. You know? So those 2 effector molecules, just very quickly, are responsible for pretty much all of the problems that we have in our tribe, from, you know, left ventricular hypertrophy, which is remodeling of the heart, and they cause elevation of hematocrit levels. They call it elevation of hypertensive levels, blood pressure. They you know, the list of deleterious consequences to those molecules is a very, very long list. So yeah, it's a very simple case of saying, for some reason, I don't know where it came from, but some bro came up with this idea that estrogen causes water retention. And we just need to explain, well, that's not actually how it works. Why are we attenuating estrogen? We need to attenuate aldosterone and angiotensin too.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's a perfect summed up explanation. Definitely. People don't realize this, and they don't realize that they need to actually work with the system, the main cause of the problem, rather than eliminating one factor, which is needed. And for what we're doing, obviously estrogen is cardiac protective, kidney protective, and cognitive protective in a sense as well. But people don't see it like that. People see it as in, oh, estrogen's making me hold water. Let's take Arimidex or Aromazin, or even some people even take letrozole. But these aromatase inhibitors obviously have a negative impact on your LDL cholesterol, and they slice in half your HDL cholesterol as well. But the likes of telmisartan and ARB,
I would be a little bit more. I'm sorry to be pedantic, but you have to understand, many of the people that listen to my content are highly educated and highly informed, and I don't want anything to be said on any of my calls that says that's not correct. So let me just clarify that. I do agree that the application of an AI has the potential to involve lipid skewing. Yeah. But I would place it a little bit more cautiously. Say this. Let's say we were to look at the behavior of using anabolic steroids and performance enhancing drugs in general. We already know that behavior has a deleterious effect on lipids. Yeah. Hopefully people know that. It's bad for our lipid profile. And then we have two choices. We could take the drug telmisartan, right, which as a PPAR agonist will improve our lipid profile. Yep. Or we could take an AI, which would have further negative impact. Again, this is just a silly conversation. So do I think that the application of an aromatase inhibitor at the dosages that are used by our tribe by themselves as a consequence are the devil's work? No, not really. But I would say here you have to say, but we already have a suppressed lipid system, and AIs only make it worse. The alternative drug that I'm proposing actually makes it better. So it's kind of like it's a no-brainer. Why would you lean into the first choice in AI? I like to say this, and I would say this: look, AIs, aromatase inhibitors, have no therapeutic body application in bodybuilding. None. They don't bring anything to the table, right, of benefit, right? But what they're doing is they're attenuating one of their anabolic pathways, and they're lowering the protective benefits of estrogen, and you're foregoing the potential benefits of a PPI agonist like telmisartan. So it just like when you lay them out on a piece of paper, draw a column down the middle, and make an argument from both. Now the one condition to that, I would say this, and that is I have the great luxury, not being a medical doctor, of making recommendations or suggestions for pharmacological practices that doctors may not be able to make. Yeah. Right? So I can just basically say, look, this is how these systems work, and this is the plan. Now, then the execution of that plan, I'll give you a simple example. It may well be easier for people to get access to an aromatase inhibitor through the underground market than it is through telmisartan. That's fair. It may also be true that an AI is cheaper than telmisartan. That's true. Yeah. But I have the luxury of saying, well, that's not really my problem. I live in a part of the world where I can access anything I want, and the cost differential is not enormous. It's not like one is a few dollars and one is $500. Yeah. So this one's $20 and this one's $40 or something akin to that. So the point being is, there are arguments to my model which I would accept. I've always maintained this. The black models are more moving parts. There's definitely more going on here. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's more to learn. Yeah. And potentially it costs more money than the way we did things in the past. You can buy an awful lot of testosterone and trenbolone and aromatase inhibitors, for just a few $100s. Yeah. It's, I don't know whether you're familiar with my I have a clash with pretty much every historical performance enhancing drug educator in history, but one of the people I clash with is the author of of a plan called Cycles for Pennies. I understand the intent. The idea behind Dante's Trudel's Cycles for Penny was, let me show you the cheapest way to use drugs. And that's not unreasonable. Yeah. Okay. I get it. But I would argue my models are potentially going to cost you more money. I'm not trying to do things the cheapest way. I'm trying to do them the safest way. And they're not necessarily, that agenda doesn't necessarily always line up. Testosterone, nandrolone, aromatase inhibitors are very, very, very cheap.
Yeah, they are definitely. You can't put a price in health.
Well, I do. I also would make the argument. I get asked all the time about what I would call novel drugs, like something new that's come onto the market that is not yet generic. Yeah. And I would say, well, it's not really practical for our tribe because that one drug is $500 a month.
Yeah.
So as interesting as that inhibitor is that you're talking about, but it's still protected by patents, so there's no generics on the market, so it's not practical for us as a tribe. We need to really be leaning into drugs that have passed patent, the patent protection process, so they're available as generics, so we can get access to them relatively inexpensively.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's a very, very true point there. Let me ask you, what are your thoughts on, mind muscle connection and sort of the cognitive effect on training within the bodybuilding?
It's interesting you say that, because the last couple of weeks there's been a flurry of content on Instagram and other social media platforms, really playing down the role that the mind muscle connection has on training. And I'm going to start making quite a lot of content on this because I think it's massively misunderstood. What I would argue is this, and that is, and I'm going to use an analogy for a minute. Like I like analogies. Some people,
me too.
Because I'm not an academic, because I'm literally just a bro. Yeah, I like I like analogies. A lot of PhDs and stuff like that don't like me using analogies, but it speaks to my audience. A lot of them don't have PhDs. When you're learning to play golf, and I know that's kind of left of field for bodybuilding, you could make a very easy argument that in the first few years of playing golf, it's about learning the stroke.
Yeah.
Learning how to move that club through three-dimensional space. And that's very true. But if you speak to any professional golfer, any golfer of merit, he'll tell you golfing is a mind game. Oh,
yeah, of course.
Dude, the difference between a decent amateur and a professional is not in their fucking swing.
No, it's not.
It's in their ability to step onto that thing when 10,000 people are watching you and not fucking choke, right?
Yeah.
And people don't understand, like, golf is a mind game. Nothing. You understand? You talk to someone that's just learning golf, they'll go, no, it's not. It's about the swing. And I'm going, no, just keep practicing your fucking swing, because in 3 or 4 years' time, you'll understand what I'm saying, right? It's when you're on the 18th green and you're playing, for $1,000, or that's small fry, but whatever, and 7 people are watching you, that it's not about your putter action, it's about your mindset.
That's very true.
It's fucking true, right? It's true, right? So people don't understand that in elite sports, at some point in all elite sports, the game changes from the skill to the mind. Yeah. And I would argue in powerlifting, it's much easier for people to understand that.
Yeah, because they have to mentally take themselves up the weight.
Correct. But when you start learning the movement through space. That's fair. Yeah. And what I don't think a lot of people understand about bodybuilding is it's just like martial arts. It's just like golf. It's just like every other professional sport there is. We begin with the mechanical movement, and you really have to teach beginners the movement. Yeah. But eventually, at some point, you move away from, biomechanics and into the mental game. So this idea that the mind-muscle connection is overrated, dude, I've never heard such a stupid statement in my life. What I would argue is, when you're starting out, if someone came into my practice today and they had no experience, talking about the mind-muscle connection it's a waste of time, right? You start teaching biomechanics, three-dimensional movement through space. But eventually you get to the point when who you train are elite athletes. I don't teach people to squat anymore. I don't. I teach them that this is a mind game. Half of nutrition or bodybuilding is mental. You have to understand, if you want to be a professional bodybuilder or just a good amateur, your life looks like this. You are going to feel either overfed or you're going to be hungry. And that is the rest of your life.
I know.
There's no place that you exist where you're happy, ever. I mean, ever. And you're going to go through periods of time where that pressure feels greater or lesser. That is fair. During competition prep, it's the worst. You're in at the end of a growth phase, an extended growth phase, where you're looking at that fucking last grain of rice on the plate, thinking, if I eat that, if I eat, I can't, like, it's one grain of rice. Dude, I'm gonna puke. But the point I'm making is, nutrition, when you're starting, is about understanding macros.
Yeah.
Okay. But eventually you get to the point where it's not about macros anymore, right? There's a very large component of mental focus and mental. I would even argue I've never said this publicly, and it'd be interesting to see what people say, but I would even argue that there's a genetic component to the way your mind works to success here.
That's quite interesting, actually.
People talk about skeletal muscle genetics, and people talk about architecture, the way you'll put together these connections, insertion points. So there is a individual genetic response that is a conversation we can have. There is architecture, which means, look, this is my skeletal structure. These are my attachment points. I would even argue there's a genetic component of the mind. The ability to basically do the same thing over and over and over again in a never-ending loop takes a certain mindset. I'll give you a simple example. If you're an airline pilot, all right, and you find yourself in a circumstance where there's an emergency, I want if I'm in the fucking plane, I want the airline pilot to do everything by the book. Just do what they fucking taught you to do, my friend. Don't be fucking winging it.
Yeah.
Do you understand what I mean? So you can take two different professions and understand, for an entrepreneur or maybe someone who's in marketing, the idea of, let's just throw some shit against the wall and see if it sticks is a fucking great idea.
Yeah.
You understand? But you don't want that from an airline pilot. Do you understand what I mean? Right?
Yeah.
And I would even argue that, like, how your brain works has a profound effect on your success as a professional bodybuilder. Are you able to do what needs to be done for fucking 10 years in a row? It's almost like, I have a saying that says the most boring man wins. Do you know what I mean by that?
It's very true. It's basically a lot of discipline. You have to repeat the same thing over and over.
Same thing over and over and over again.
Get your foot up as you go along or back down, depending on the phase,
And the interesting thing about this is, and this is, I have many observations that I don't speak to. One of the reasons I don't lose arguments is I will only ever argue something that can't be argued. Yeah. I have a whole bunch of things that I think, but I don't talk about because, I really don't have enough evidence to support them. And this is one of them. I would argue that there's a certain mindset that when you meet a certain individual, there are guys who want to start taking drugs in the first 12 months. I can almost guarantee you they're not going to cut it. You understand what I'm saying? They're already waving the flag to me going, you're not going to make it. Because I lasted 20 fucking years before I turned to it. That doesn't mean I didn't think about it. That doesn't mean I didn't, sit down and do soul searching about where am I going. And I don't expect anyone to last 20 years. That's ridiculous. But I would argue that anyone that's going to make it as a high-end professional bodybuilder just inherently knows that there's at least 3 years before the drugs, minimum.
Yeah.
But they know that coming in. You don't need to explain that to them. They know that. They know that there's stuff to learn. There's gains on the table to be picked up without bringing the drugs to the table. They're not saying I'm going to be natural. They're saying those are future gains that come when the time is right. And this is what I'm saying. So when you talk about those people that want to get in early, doing what I would argue is that's a really good indicator flag that they're not going to cut it in this game.
You can see in their behavioral patterns and stuff as well, they're never going to cut it. You know, they're not into it enough. You know, you eat and you breathe this sport, you know, whenever you do it properly. It
is a lifestyle.
Drink at the weekend, you know, have takeouts every single weekend, or don't care about their food. You can tell by people's behavioral patterns and how they react and the reaction to what you tell them and stuff, depending on their mindset of where they're going to end up. You can really predict it.
I will give you a simple example. I myself am in the process of learning to ride dirt bikes. I've been a motorcycle enthusiast all my life, but I've always been a road rider. Yeah. So I have a young son. He's, 12 years old, going on 13 now. He can't ride on the road. It's something that we're doing together. He has a bike and I have a bike. Yeah. And we're riding a road. What's the interesting thing is, like the way that I'm teaching myself to ride dirt bikes is very similar to the way that I taught myself to ride, to train in the gym, right? Which is literally, I will go on my bike and do 30 minutes of routines that the average person just won't do because it's boring and it's repetitive. But I've noticed even in less than a year of riding dirt bike, I'm about to, at the end of October, I'm going to do my first enduro race. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's like pretty hardcore off-road. Like that's pretty interesting for a guy in his mid-50s riding for 1 year. But what I put it down to is, one, willing to pay people to coach me. Yeah. So I've hired a coach. And then I have drills, if you understand what drills are. Yeah. It's that I go through that the average dirt bike rider, he gets on the bike, he starts the bike, he rides the track and puts it away. I will sit in my garage for 30 minutes doing balancing, routines on my bike, and my skill levels have just taken off in the last 12 months. And the point I'm making is, I would argue that in almost any sport, golf, soccer, swimming, whatever, you can tell very early how successful someone's going to be by the way they approach the fundamentals.
By their mindset.
And by their mindset. And this is the point where we, closing off this. So this is the point where, like, it's this really interesting conversation where you have groups of the community saying, look, it's all about mechanics, and I'm saying, okay, fair enough for beginners.
Yeah, for beginners, definitely.
For beginners, fair enough. I don't have a problem with that because you have to teach them something, and the best you can really teach them is three-dimensional movement through space. But if you're serious about this game, at some point, you need to cross that chasm and understand that ultimately this is a mental game.
Yeah, it's like, if you look at normal people, like the average Joe person, if you look at their behavioral patterns, look at their weight, look at their eating patterns, what they do, the things that they do, and then you look at the likes of even an amateur bodybuilder, the people, the normal people will be like, oh, why are you eating that? Why do you not go out? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And they don't understand because, as you said, it's not drilled in them.
No. So this is something I'm going to be making a lot of content about moving forward. So because we just don't talk about this. The interesting thing is though, I don't really feel that I have a claim to this in any way because this is what we talked about when I was young.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted to train at Gold's because that was the mecca of bodybuilding, and we all took the pilgrimage there because you just wanted to be around that shit.
And the environment, the place you're in, like your mindset in there, even the place, I believe, like, I recently have been training at another gym at the minute, and just from changing place and me thinking in my head that I am going to train harder here because I thought that, it's actually making me train harder.
Correct. Where you train, who you train with, the music you listen to. I would even argue the clothes that you wear. I know that sounds a bit woo, but I would even argue the clothes you wear.
I really think that if you have an outfit that you feel, oh, I'm looking good in this outfit. Last time I benched 105 kilos in this outfit. Oh, I'm getting it today. It's just a mindset shift. That shit matters, my friend. That shit matters. And the funny thing is, but we used to know that. And today we seem to be losing that thing. It's a little bit like the discussion about
volume and intensity, and there was a time where you went to the gym and there was, sweating and swearing and farting and grunting going on, and it was a fabulous time had by all. It's become so gentrified in gyms today that I would even argue that gentrification of the gym system has the potential to be deleterious to your training outcomes. It's really designed for the corporate environment where people can come in and do their things. But if you use this piece of equipment, I mean, I'm very mindful of the commercial sensitivities as well. But if you sweat and you grunt too much and you do this and you do that, you may put off the 95 corporate customers that are coming through. Yeah. But I would even argue that part of that is necessary for elite athletes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And it's one of the reasons that I took the time myself during COVID to build my own private training studio. So even here in Thailand, we're starting to get, the touch of the political correctness. You can't sweat and you can't wear, tank tops. And like if you wear a stringer, they wear a stringer because, God forbid the guy across the road sees, and feels like ashamed of, whatever the outcome is. All of that stuff, in my opinion, matters.
Your session.
It matters.
If you're going into a gym and you feel you can't grunt, you feel you can't, wear a tank top, you feel you can't be in that environment mentally where you need to be in to progress, you're in a negative headspace before you go in because you're thinking, I can't wear my tank top. I can't grunt when I'm lifting. You'll be, let's say you're trying to finish at 3 reps in reserve, you'll get the 5 reps in reserve and you're a bit of grunt and you'll just pin it. It's going to affect your overall progress.
So I'm going to be, as I said, nine times here, I'm going to start making some content about this because I think it's a lost art, understanding the mental execution towards our hypertrophic goals. So anyway, cool. So we've got a few minutes left. I try to keep this call to about an hour because, in my experience, people will listen for an hour, and that's about as long as they get. So how about we get a couple more questions in, and we'll wind it up, buddy.
That's cool. Can you explain over basically sort of like the Black Death model that you use and the accumulation of volume over a 4-week mesocycle with the 5th week deload?
Mm-hmm.
Just a bit of insight.
Okay, so I would argue that most trainers, right, really should be following the same training framework that we have been using in our community for the last 30 years. So let me first explain what that is, and then I'll explain the exceptions to those rules. It basically says, look, somewhere between 10 and 20 sets per body part. And there's obviously always going to be some confusion about how exactly you count sets. But if you think about it, 10 to 20 sets allows for that. The guys that don't count the warm-up sets are going to have 10, 15, sets. The guys that do are probably going to be leaning towards the upper end. Doing 10 to 20 sets per body part. There's 8 body parts. Understanding that we are going to be directing more volume to larger body parts and less volume to smaller body parts. A simple example would be if we were to train back and biceps together, not that you have to, but let's say you did, you patch those two together, you would expect to see maybe 20 sets for back and maybe 10 sets for biceps, and understanding that you're effectively creating mechanical tension on the biceps when you're training back anyway.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Yep. Okay. I would also argue that, a training frequency of about 2 times a week is gonna be a good place for most people to start. Okay. So if we understand we train twice a week, each body part, 10 to 20 sets, and then what happens is over your career, you're going to be forced to, you don't have a choice. You're going to be forced to add volume and add weight on the bar as your career progresses. But neither one of those 2 runways are infinite. You eventually run out of the ability to put more weight on the bar, or you run out of your ability to train more volume just simply on time management. If you look back at the 1970s, the way we used to train in the high volume era, guys like Arnold were training, in 3 times a week frequency. He was training, 50 or 60 sets per body part, but he trained for 2 hours in the morning, went and had lunch, took a sleep on the beach and went back to the gym in the afternoon. We don't have time to do that.
Oh, definitely not.
So in other words, like if training's not an infinite vector because you run out of time. Yeah. So what I would argue is that's where everyone should start. You start over there, but eventually you're going to run out of those runways. And when you do, there's really only two things that are left. One is training intensity techniques that you use in the gym designed to raise the intensity of the training movement. Yeah. There's lots and lots of them. Lots of people talk about them all the time. So I don't think there's need to go into that. And then what I would argue is this, the idea of massively disproportionate distribution of volume. What I mean by that is rather than every body part gets worked equally, we start focusing on one body part at a time. Yeah. So I used the golf analogy before. Let's use the golf analogy again.
Yeah. The golf analogy.
So you could say if you were training to play golf, you need to spend some time at the driving range. You need to be spending some time on your middle, like on your middle game, on your driving game, and you need to be spend some time on your putting. Yeah. Now, what I would argue is this: if your putting sucks, like my putting sucks, not that I play golf, but I have played, then what I would argue is maybe you should put Big Bertha away for a little bit and just focus on putting. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So the premise of Black Death basically says, look, if your calves are your weak body part, what we're going to do is train them every fucking day. No? You can't train every body part with that level of priority. You have to push something forward.
Yeah.
Does it make sense? Yep. So I would say, look, you train your legs, say, twice a week, and you say, look, I'm not happy with my legs. So what I'm going to say is, look, I'm going to take some of this volume allocation for chest and back and shoulders and redirect it to our legs so that we can then do much more volume on our legs, because I have no problem with the idea of volume is a driver of hypertrophy, but it's not the driver. It's a driver. Yeah. And so the premise here is you either use an intensity technique to move forward or you use a volume technique to move forward. These are the two choices you have. If you choose the volume technique, then really the only choice you have is saying, look, I was doing 10 to 20 sets per body part per week. If I want to keep going to 25 to 30 sets, even hell, all the way to 50 or 60 sets like we used to do, right?
Yeah.
You can certainly do that, but if you think that you can do that systemically, right, then you're mistaken, because if you can suddenly take on another 20 hardworking sets a week, all of a sudden, I'm going to ask you why you're being such a fucking pussy in the gym now.
Yeah, because you're not training hard enough, and that's the case.
Like, what you can suddenly take on another 20 sets. And so in other words, what you do is you have to give me 20 sets so I can give you 20 sets in return.
Yeah.
And that's the premise of Black Death, which is what we would call massively redistributed volume load, where we're picking a body part like calves or quads or chest and redirecting massive volume at it in an extended fashion for a relatively short block of time, and then moving on to another body part. And that's not really how we train. Most people today train they want everything to grow at the same time. Right? Yeah. I'm at the point in my career whereby I don't think that that's possible with my age, my training age, and my biological age. And so what I tend to do is say, right, if I can get some progress on chest this month, I'll be happy.
Yeah.
And then I'll move on to, say, back, and then I'll move on to shoulders, and I'll move through a sequence of events. And what I would argue is, but that technique is not something you need to give to beginners, because beginners are able to get progression and progress out of a much simpler and easier and easier to execute model.
Yeah.
So what I would argue is, who do I hold Black Death for? I hold Black Death for people that, one, you have a week or 2 week body parts that are well behind everything else. Yep. So we need to bring your calves up. We need to bring your quads up. We're going to do Black Death. Yeah. Or alternatively, I would give it to someone like myself that has so much training age, that's so close to their genetic potential that realistically you need to, you need to change the game for them.
Yeah.
So someone of extreme training age, someone that's been at this for 15 years, yeah, you'd go, okay, so this is potentially model for. It's not something for someone in the first couple of years of training. Just follow the regular pathway of adding weight to the bar and adding volume to the bar, and leave Black Death for when you run out of runway and come and talk to us then.
Yeah, I'm with you. I understand. No,
Yeah.
I just wanted to sort of address your training method, your model there, because it's very interesting. I was watching it on the masterclass, and I thought it would
Not that it doesn't work. I mean, anyone can use it, but what I would argue is like it's of the greatest value. It's like my drug models. You understand, if you're already a professional bodybuilder, okay, there's far less value for you in a lifetime exposure model than there is someone that's stepping up for the first time.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
For someone that's stepping up for the first time, it's like, holy crap, look at this, is unbelievable. This model's laid out the next 30 years of my life have been laid out for me, what it looks like. Yeah. If you're already waist deep in that, then you would look at the black model and find it to be of less value. And that's completely reasonable. Same thing with the Black Death model. At some point, you know, when you run out of volume, at the point where you're saying, look, I only have an hour a day to train, I only have this much time. At the point where you load up the bar and get underneath it and go, look, I'm probably uncomfortable putting more weight on the bar because I'm, aware of the fact that my injury risk is getting, you're close to the limits of how much tonnage you want to move.
Yeah.
Then a model like Black Death certainly makes a lot of sense. It's a very valid